Have you ever met someone who just seems to see things more clearly than everyone else in the room? Not because they are louder, not because they have more credentials, not because they talk the fastest or read the most books. There is something different about the way they process the world, the way they stay composed when everything around them is chaotic, the way they make decisions that other people only understand in hindsight, the way they seem unmoved by things that send everyone else into a spiral. Most people call it wisdom. Some call it emotional intelligence. Others just call it impressive and leave it at that. But the Stoics had a specific name for it. And more importantly, they had a specific method for developing it. They called it living according to reason, and they believed it was available to anyone willing to do the daily, deliberate work of cultivating it. This video is about 10 of the most powerful keys the Stoics developed for thinking more clearly, seeing more accurately, and ultimately outsmarting, not in the petty, competitive sense, but in the genuine, liberating sense of simply operating at a level above the noise that traps most people. Stay with me until the end, because the 10th key is the one the Stoics themselves considered the master key, the one that unlocks every other item on this list. Marcus Aurelius was arguably the most powerful person alive during his lifetime, emperor of Rome, commander of vast armies, responsible for millions of lives, and he spent every morning writing private reminders to himself about how to think better, not how to rule better, not how to win more wars, not how to accumulate more wealth, how to think better, because he understood something that most powerful people never grasp, that the quality of your thinking determines the quality of every decision, every relationship, and every outcome in your life. Epictetus, who had no power at all by the world's definition, born a slave, owning nothing, controlling nothing about his external circumstances, somehow developed a mind so precise and so free that his ideas are still being studied and practiced 2,000 years later. Seneca, one of the wealthiest and most politically connected men of his era, wrote constantly about how easy it is for a sharp mind to be dulled by comfort, distraction, and the noise of other people's opinions. These three men had almost nothing in common in terms of their circumstances, but they shared one thing completely: a commitment to thinking well. And the keys they developed for doing so are exactly what we are going to unpack today. But before we get into key number 1, if you are getting value from this, take 1 second right now and hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it helps this content reach more people who need it. And if you are not yet subscribed, do it now and ring the bell so you never miss a video like this one. All right, let us get into it. Key number 1, they separate what they can control from what they cannot. This is the foundation of everything in Stoic philosophy. And it is also the foundation of clear thinking. Most people spend the majority of their mental energy on things they cannot change: the economy, other people's opinions, the past, what might happen in an uncertain future. The Stoics called this the dichotomy of control, the sharp line between what belongs to us and what does not. Epictetus built his entire philosophy on this single distinction. He taught that within our control are our opinions, our desires, our responses, our values, and our effort. Everything else, our reputation, our health, whether people like us, whether our plans succeed, these belong to the category of things outside our control. And the moment we accept that fully, something extraordinary happens to the quality of our thinking. When your mind is no longer burning through its resources trying to control the uncontrollable, it becomes available for the things that actually matter. You start seeing problems more clearly because you are not clouded by anxiety about outcomes you never governed in the first place. You start making better decisions because you are focused on the inputs, your effort, your reasoning, your values, rather than desperately grasping at outputs. Marcus Aurelius practiced this every single day. He would remind himself what belonged to him and what did not as a passive surrender, but as an act of strategic mental clarity. He understood that the person who has stopped fighting imaginary battles has vastly more cognitive and emotional resources available for real ones. Try this today. In any situation causing you stress, ask yourself one simple question: is this within my control? If yes, direct your full energy toward it. If no, make the deliberate choice to redirect your energy. That single habit, practiced consistently, will change the quality of your thinking more than almost anything else on this list. The ancient Stoics did not treat this as an occasional exercise. They treated it as a constant filter running underneath every decision they made. Epictetus would begin his teaching with this distinction and return to it constantly because he knew from personal experience what it meant to have everything external stripped away. When you own nothing, when your physical freedom is not even your own, you discover very quickly that the only unconquerable territory you possess is your own mind. And that realization, rather than being crushing, is one of the most liberating insights a human being can ever arrive at. The person who has genuinely internalized this key stops bleeding mental energy into things that were never theirs to control, and that energy, now available, now undiluted, is exactly what makes their thinking look effortless to everyone who hasn't made the same distinction. Key number 2. They think in first principles, not borrowed opinions. There is a kind of thinking that most people never escape, the kind where you believe something because someone you respect believed it, or because you heard it enough times that it started to feel true, or because the crowd around you accepts it as obvious. The Stoics called borrowed opinions of this kind mere appearances, impressions that had been accepted without examination, and they considered unexamined impressions to be one of the primary sources of poor judgment. The Stoic practice was to strip every belief and assumption back to its foundations, to ask not, "What do people say about this?" but, "What do I actually know to be true about this when I examine it clearly?" This is what philosophers call first principles thinking, reasoning from the ground up rather than from the top down. Marcus Aurelius practiced this relentlessly. When confronting a difficult decision, he did not ask what tradition demanded or what others expected. He asked what reason, when honestly applied, actually recommended. This made him consistently harder to manipulate, consistently harder to deceive, and consistently more accurate in his judgments than the people around him who were operating on unexamined assumptions. The practical version of this key is deceptively simple. Whenever you notice yourself believing something, pause and ask where that belief actually came from. Did you examine it or inherit it? Does the evidence support it, or does it simply feel familiar? Familiarity is not the same as truth. Comfort is not the same as accuracy. The person who has learned to separate what they actually know from what they have simply absorbed will consistently make sharper, more original, and more effective decisions than the person who never bothers to ask the question. There is also a social dimension to this key that the Stoics understood very clearly. The person who thinks from first principles will frequently arrive at conclusions that the crowd around them finds uncomfortable or strange, because the crowd is almost always operating from inherited assumptions rather than examined reasoning. Marcus Aurelius accepted this without anxiety. He was not trying to be different. He was simply trying to be accurate. And accuracy, in a world where most thinking is secondhand, will always look remarkable. Key number 3. They use negative visualization to stay ahead of reality. This is one of the Stoics' most counterintuitive and most powerful mental tools. In a world that constantly tells you to think positively, to visualize success, to keep your focus on best-case scenarios, the Stoics did something almost entirely the opposite. They deliberately imagined the worst. They called this practice premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, and far from being a pessimistic habit, it was actually one of the sharpest strategic advantages in their entire philosophical toolkit. Marcus Aurelius regularly contemplated the loss of things he valued, his health, his relationships, his position, his life, not to indulge in fear or despair, but to do two very specific things. First, to genuinely appreciate what he had before it was gone, because humans are extraordinarily bad at valuing things they take for granted. Second, to think clearly about what he would do if those things were actually removed, to prepare mentally and emotionally before the pressure arrived, rather than scrambling to think clearly in the middle of a crisis. Seneca wrote, "Let us prepare our minds as if we had come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing." The person who has already mentally walked through the loss of their job knows exactly how they would respond if it happened. The person who has already imagined how they would handle a serious health crisis does not fall apart when one arrives. They have already done the cognitive work in conditions of calm, which means they are not doing it for the first time under conditions of panic. This is a profound thinking advantage. While most people are blindsided by adversity, spending precious mental energy adjusting to the shock before they can even begin to solve the problem, the person who practices negative visualization has already adjusted. They are already in solution mode. They have already outsmarted the crisis before it arrived. Key number 4. They observe their own thinking without becoming it. This key is what modern psychology would call metacognition, the ability to think about your thinking. But the Stoics developed it thousands of years before the term existed, and they built it into a daily practice rather than leaving it as an abstract concept. The central Stoic insight here is this: you are not your thoughts. Your thoughts are impressions that arise in your mind, and impressions can be examined, questioned, and either accepted or rejected. Epictetus taught that the single most important skill a person could develop was the ability to pause between receiving an impression and assenting to it. That pause, that gap between stimulus and response, is where wisdom lives. Most people have no gap at all. Something happens, an emotion rises, and immediately it becomes an action. Someone says something dismissive and immediately they feel wounded and react defensively. A plan falls apart and immediately they feel defeated and give up. There is no observation, no examination, no space for reason to enter. People who have developed this Stoic key operate differently. They feel the emotion. The Stoics were not advocates of emotional suppression, but they watch it, they name it, they examine it. They ask whether it is responding to reality accurately or whether it is being triggered by something else entirely. This capacity for self-observation without self-identification is what allows them to remain composed while everyone else is reactive. Not because they feel less, but because they have developed the ability to look at what they feel before they are consumed by it. This is a skill that compounds over time in a remarkable way. The first few times you practice it, pausing, noticing the impression, examining it before assenting to it, it feels awkward and deliberate. But practiced over months and years, it becomes the natural rhythm of your mind. You stop being ambushed by your own reactions. You stop waking up the next morning regretting what you said in a moment of emotion. You stop making decisions from positions of fear or anger that you later have to undo at great cost. The Stoics considered this the difference between a person who has trained their mind and a person who is simply at the mercy of whatever impression arrives next. And they considered that difference to be one of the most important distinctions between a person living freely and a person living as an internal captive. Key number 5, they measure themselves against their own standards, not other people's. The moment you begin measuring your success, your intelligence, or your worth against other people, you have handed control of your internal state to the infinite and ever-shifting behavior of the people around you. Someone will always be smarter in some area. Someone will always be richer. Someone will always appear to have figured something out that you haven't. If your standard for how you're doing is calibrated against other people, you will spend your life either inflated by hollow superiority or deflated by inevitable comparison. The Stoics rejected this completely. They called it living according to the crowd, allowing other people's standards, opinions, and apparent achievements to define what you should be aiming for. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Do not waste the remainder of your life in thoughts about other people." This was not an instruction to be indifferent to others. It was an instruction to stop using others as the measuring stick for your own progress. The Stoic standard was always internal. Are you living according to your own deepest values? Are you making decisions consistent with reason and virtue? Are you better in the ways that actually matter than you were yesterday? This standard is entirely within your control, which means progress against it is always available to you regardless of what anyone else is doing. The person who measures themselves against their own highest standards develops a kind of focused, undistractable drive that the person perpetually distracted by comparison never quite manages to find. And that focus, accumulated over time, produces a quality of thinking and a quality of life that is genuinely remarkable. Not because they competed their way there, but because they stopped competing entirely and simply got on with the actual work. Key number 6. They seek discomfort as a tool for clarity. The Stoics had an unusual relationship with comfort. They did not see it as the goal of a good life. They saw it at best as neutral and at worst as one of the primary dullers of human intelligence and character. Seneca practiced what he called voluntary hardship, periodically choosing to live with less, eat simpler food, sleep without luxury, and remove the cushions of comfort deliberately. Not because he was an ascetic who despised pleasure, but because he had observed something crucial. Comfort breeds assumptions. When everything is easy, you stop questioning whether you could cope without it. You start believing you need things that are actually optional. You lose the precise awareness of what is essential and what is merely habitual. The person who has voluntarily sat with discomfort knows exactly what they are actually made of. They have tested their own resilience in conditions where no one forced them to, which gives them a kind of self-knowledge that the person who has always been comfortable simply does not have access to. And self-knowledge, for the Stoics, was not a luxury or an indulgence. It was a prerequisite for clear thinking. You cannot reason well about yourself if you have never tested yourself. You cannot make accurate assessments about what you need, what you can tolerate, or what you are genuinely capable of if your entire life has been arranged to protect you from ever finding out. Seek discomfort deliberately, not recklessly, not for the sake of suffering, but with the Stoic understanding that the edges of your comfort zone are exactly where accurate self-knowledge is found, and accurate self-knowledge is the foundation of everything else. Seneca was not suggesting you live in poverty or deprivation permanently. He was suggesting that periodic, voluntary encounters with hardship remind you what is essential, strip away your unexamined dependencies, and return you to a clear-eyed understanding of what you actually are without the scaffolding of comfort. The person who has done this has a kind of unshakable quality that other people recognize and cannot quite explain, because they are watching someone who has already met themselves under pressure, already confirmed that they can function without the things most people consider indispensable, already passed a test that most people avoid their entire lives. That is a thinking advantage of the highest order. Key number 7. They understand that most urgency is manufactured. One of the greatest thinking traps in modern life, and it was just as present in the ancient world, is the illusion of urgency. The feeling that everything is immediate, that every problem demands your attention right now, that you must respond, decide, and react without delay. This feeling is almost always wrong. The Stoics were deeply suspicious of urgency, not because they were slow or indifferent to genuine emergencies, but because they understood that panic, by its very nature, is the enemy of clear thinking. When you believe you must act this instant, you bypass reason. You react from the most primitive and least accurate parts of your mind. You make the decision your fear recommends rather than the decision your reason recommends. Marcus Aurelius practiced a kind of deliberate deceleration in his decision-making. He would remind himself to step back from the press of events, to observe rather than react, to give himself the gift of a moment's distance before committing to any action. Seneca wrote, "There is nothing so ruinous to good character as lounging at shows. Vices creep in more easily when pleasure provides the approach." His point was subtle. It is not just obvious crises that disrupt thinking. It is the slow, accumulated noise of treating everything as urgent that gradually erodes the capacity for genuine reflection. Practice the discipline of asking before reacting to anything that feels urgent. Is this actually urgent, or does it simply feel that way? Most things that feel urgent in the moment reveal themselves, on a second's examination, to be perfectly capable of waiting for a considered response. And the decisions made after that second's examination are almost always sharper, wiser, and less regretted than the decisions made in the grip of manufactured urgency. Key number 8. They choose their associations with extreme deliberateness. Epictetus taught something that most people would rather not hear, that you become, in large part, a reflection of the people you spend the most time with. Not because you are weak or impressionable, but because human minds are social organs, deeply influenced by the thinking patterns, the assumptions, the emotional habits, and the standards of those around them. If you spend the majority of your time with people who complain habitually, you will begin to see the world through a lens of complaint, not because you decided to, but because that lens was available constantly and your mind absorbed it. If you spend your time with people who think carefully, who ask good questions, who hold themselves accountable to high standards, your mind absorbs that instead. Marcus Aurelius was ruthlessly intentional about this. Despite being emperor and having no shortage of people who wanted his time and attention, he curated his intellectual companions with extraordinary care, seeking out people who challenged his thinking rather than people who simply agreed with it. He understood that the people around you are not a neutral backdrop to your life. They are an active ingredient in the quality of your mind. This key does not require you to be cold, dismissive, or unkind to people who are not at the level you are aiming for. It simply requires that you are deliberate, that you protect the time and mental space reserved for the associations that genuinely elevate your thinking, rather than giving the majority of your attention to associations that merely fill time. Seneca had a pointed way of putting this. He wrote that you should associate with those who are likely to make you better, and that you should welcome into your life those whom you yourself are capable of improving. It is a two-way standard. You are looking not for people who simply impress you or entertain you, but people with whom the exchange of ideas, values, and honest feedback genuinely produces something better in both directions. That kind of association is rarer than most people admit. But once you have found it, once you have built even one or two relationships of genuine intellectual and moral seriousness, you will understand immediately and viscerally why the Stoics treated the quality of their associations as one of the most critical decisions of their lives. Key number 9. They treat every obstacle as a source of information. The Stoics had a famous relationship with obstacles, one that looks almost irrational from the outside, but is, on closer examination, one of the most sophisticated cognitive strategies ever developed. Rather than seeing obstacles as interruptions to progress, they saw them as the actual material of progress. Marcus Aurelius wrote what has become perhaps the most famous line in all of Stoic philosophy: "The obstacle is the way." This was not motivational rhetoric. It was a precise cognitive instruction. When something blocks your path, the Stoic response is not frustration, not despair, not the frantic search for a way around it at any cost. It is examination. What is this obstacle actually telling me? What does it reveal about my plan, my assumptions, my approach? What can I learn from this resistance that I would never have learned if things had gone smoothly? The person who has trained themselves to ask these questions when they hit a wall is extracting value from every difficulty. They are learning faster than their peers who only learn from success, because failure, resistance, and obstacle contain far more information than smooth sailing ever does. A plan that works perfectly tells you very little. A plan that fails tells you exactly where your thinking was flawed. The Stoic who meets an obstacle with curiosity rather than frustration has a genuine cognitive advantage over the person who meets it with only resistance, because they are getting information that the resistant person is too emotionally invested to see. And now, before we move into the 10th and final key, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something. You have made it through 9 of these keys already. Most people click away long before this point. Most people scroll on the moment content asks more of them than passive entertainment. But you stayed, and that tells me something real about why you are here. This is not background noise for you. Something in this material is speaking to something genuine in you. So thank you sincerely for being here. And I promise you that this final key is the one the Stoics themselves considered the master key, the one without which everything else on this list eventually crumbles. Stay with me. Key number 10. They practice the daily discipline of self-examination. Every single key on this list, every tool, every habit, every cognitive strategy, depends entirely on one practice to hold it together and keep it growing. The Stoics called it the evening review, and every major Stoic philosopher either practiced it themselves or taught it to their students as non-negotiable. Before sleeping each night, you examine the day honestly, not to punish yourself, not to perform humility, but to gather information, accurate, unvarnished information about how close your actual behavior came to your stated values and where the gap was. Seneca wrote about this practice in his own words. "When the light has been removed and my wife has fallen silent, aware of the habit that's now mine, I examine my entire day and go back over what I've done and said, hiding nothing from myself, passing nothing by. This is the practice that makes everything else work. The dichotomy of control stays sharp only if you regularly examine whether you are actually applying it. First principles thinking remains precise only if you regularly ask yourself what assumptions have crept back in unchecked. Negative visualization remains useful only if you actually sit with it deliberately. The metacognitive gap between stimulus and response widens only if you review daily how many times you failed to use it and why. Self-examination is the maintenance practice of the sharp mind. Without it, the other 9 keys slowly blunt. With it, they continuously sharpen. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations as exactly this practice. A daily private reckoning with himself, never intended for anyone else's eyes, never polished or performed, simply honest. What did I do well today? Where did I fall short? What would have been the wiser response? What will I do differently tomorrow? These are not complicated questions. They require no special equipment, no external teacher, no formal philosophy degree. They require only 10 minutes of honest silence at the end of each day. And the person who brings that 10 minutes of honest self-examination to each day, every day without exception, will compound their thinking capacity at a rate that the person who never examines themselves simply cannot match. Not because they are naturally smarter, but because they are learning continuously from their own experience, extracting lessons that most people walk right past, and refining their judgment in real time rather than waiting for circumstances to force it on them. Now let us bring all 10 keys together. They separate what they can control from what they cannot. They think in first principles, not borrowed opinions. They use negative visualization to stay ahead of reality. They observe their own thinking without becoming it. They measure themselves against their own standards, not other people's. They seek discomfort as a tool for clarity. They understand that most urgency is manufactured. They choose their associations with extreme deliberateness. They treat every obstacle as a source of information. And they practice the daily discipline of self-examination. None of these are gifts that some people are born with and others are not. Every single one of them is a practice, a discipline, a choice made again and again until it becomes the default way your mind operates. The Stoics did not believe in passive transformation. They believed in active, daily, deliberate investment in the quality of your own thinking, because they understood that everything else in life flows from that quality. Your decisions, your relationships, your resilience, your peace, all of it is downstream from how clearly and honestly you think. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That sentence is the whole of it. The 10 keys in this video are simply 10 specific ways to practice that realization daily, until it becomes not a philosophy you hold intellectually, but a way of being you inhabit completely. What would change in your life if you applied even 3 of these keys consistently for the next 90 days? What decisions would you make differently? What reactions would you pause before? What assumptions would you actually examine instead of simply accepting? You do not have to answer those questions out loud. Sit with them. Let them do their work quietly. That in itself is the beginning of the practice. If this video spoke to something in you, if even one of these 10 keys made you stop and actually think, then something has already shifted. Do not scroll past that feeling. Sit with it. Carry it with you. If you found genuine value here, hit the like button. It helps this video reach more people who are ready to think at a different level. Subscribe if you have not already, and share this with someone in your life who you know is capable of more than their current thinking is allowing them to access. Leave a comment below telling me which of the 10 keys hit hardest for you, or which one you know will be the most difficult to actually practice. I read them. Until next time, think clearly, examine honestly, and remember the words of Epictetus. It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows. Stay sharp, stay grounded, stay free.